Good morning. I'll reintroduce myself. My name's Margot Ravenscroft. I'm the director currently at Amicus. And this morning we are so very pleased to have the lovely Jane Officer, who really is the start of the story of Amicus. So 30 years ago, after the, 30 years ago today, after the incredibly sad execution of Andrew, Jane is the person who decided she couldn't sit still and not do anything about this situation and created Amicus. And 30 years on, here we are. So I really, obviously, we couldn't do this day without having a chat to Jane about what inspired her and how she feels now. So welcome, Jane. Thank you for coming to talk to us. Let's start off by just going back even further than 30 years. And could you tell us a little bit about what inspired, motivated you to start writing to someone on death row?
Well, when I read about what was happening and what the response had been in this country to what was going on in America, and lifelines were set up, I actually applied to them and said that I would be prepared to write to a pen friend in America. And I suppose the motivation behind it was my work life, which was actually working in Handsworth here in Birmingham with Black teenagers, people who had been excluded from schools and that sort of thing, and seeing the injustice that they had to go through when they began sus laws and all of those things happened. And I just felt, I was absolutely shocked at the number of people who were actually on death row in America anyway. So when I had this opportunity and was given this name of Andrew Lee Jones, I'll never forget that day. It's a long, thin envelope with this name on it. And it says Louisiana State Penitentiary, which is a word we don't use in this country. That immediately put you into a different frame of mind about what you were doing. And actually, I was very nervous about writing that first letter, because you have to think, why am I doing this? And I felt it's, I could see that it was going to be a painful experience in lots of ways, and it was. But once I'd started, and reflecting on, and forgotten about this. I used to talk to Andrew about some of the young people was working with, and he was always interested to know what was happening over here in that respect. So starting to write to him, it seemed very soon to be a very natural thing to do, because he was like an older son to me, really, in many ways. So especially when he told me that he had no real connection with his family at that time, which you think, oh, that's a dreadful thing, but it wasn't at all. It was to do with poverty as much as anything. They only lived the other side of the Mississippi, but they hadn't any means of getting to do the visits because of getting across there, and visiting time in American prisons is very difficult anyway. It starts about 6 in the morning and is finished by about 1 o'clock. So you've got to gear your own day to that. So yes, I think if I think about it now, 30 years on, which seems improbable that it was 30 years ago, that, very quickly became absorbed on a weekly basis, because I wrote at least once a week, into a totally different world that was similar in many ways to the injustices that went along in my work life, but on a different scale altogether. So I think that was it. And we had a rapport straight away, which I think was the important thing about it. But the other thing I think was really important is that I began to see my own life in a different way. I had freedom. I had my own children who were in their teens at that, tweens, early 20s at that time. And you sort of begin to evaluate the things that you enjoy doing, the freedoms that you have, the possibility of going, and I think anybody who's read the book will know that what Andrew enjoyed most, which I managed to send him, were books about Wales, about the countryside, you know, doing things, pleasurable things that I suppose 30 years on is quite similar to what we're going through with the pandemic now. We begin to appreciate the ordinary things of life so much better, you know, going for a walk either on your own or with a friend or with a dog, or noticing things that you haven't noticed before. I mean, I've done that. I've discovered places within walking distance where I live that I didn't know.
I'm interested in that Andrew enjoyed these, and I've heard this with other people, that Andrew was enjoying information about somewhere that's so far away. So a book about Wales, for example, when he's in Louisiana, it's such a remote thing from where he is.
Oh, totally. But it lifted him out of a locked up cell and placed him on a mountainside or in a wood. And he really, really appreciated that. And I think as I say, I think we're going through a similar thing. It's why, you know, so many country programs are on television, why so the vets programs, anything which is to deal with everyday life and so on, is so important to us. And we can actually go to these places if we want to, but, you know, it's a different thing altogether. I think it's sort of, it's more that, you know, the other thing is, and I think this is important if you can weave this in, that even though it was found at his trial that subsequently that, you know, he'd been brain damaged from the work he did when he was a child with, you know, on the fields when they put the pesticides down on the cotton fields. And he had to have the flags to show where the next line was for putting it and getting that.
Yeah.
That in fact, you know, there's a different intelligence in a way that I would never, you know, writing to him particularly. The first few letters are quite brief, and from him, you know, they're quite brief, and, you know, the unsureness of why I would want to write to him, because that wasn't his experience with particularly white people, but people in general. But he gradually grew himself. His letter writing as he goes through becomes more, I don't know whether we get as far as profound, but we get as far as more insightful, more thinking about it. And, you know, when he reveals that he was upset about the guy who couldn't write, and so he decided to show, even though his writing was pretty poor, he wanted to show somebody else that he could help another inmate with writing and so on. And I think it's that the way that maybe from the first time since his father had died, to whom he was very attached, as we know, that his own humanity came through on that, and that he was able to grow as a person, which when it came to his execution, you feel, and it wasn't the first time I did with Feltus, who I went to his execution 10 years exactly later, everybody the same, lawyers and everything, when he was executed, was this actually reaching a point where, although they didn't want to accept the execution, they were better people in themselves. They thought of themselves in a better way as a result of going through that terrible experience of being locked up and feeling so unimportant, except as a monster. And it's so matched up to my own personal life, but also my work life, which was involved. So I think I became, I'm sure it did, I'm sure I became, gave me more insight, certainly into racism and how, you know, people are treated.
Through your work more, or through your experience with writing to Andrew and other people on death row?
They both fed into one another. Andrew and I educated one another. I think there was just as much him teaching me what it was about through his experiences and what was going on, and what I gave him in terms of ever, albeit in virtual, escape.
Yeah.
Because that would call it. I can read the books and go in. I can escape for a while in those mountains and those woods and imagine running through. I think at one point he said, I can imagine running through the woods. You know, it's that sort of, and I think, you know, it was, that was important to both of us, I think. But I learned such a lot from him.
And so coming back to when you had been writing for, you know, a number of months, and what was it that, when were you actually contacted about you physically going over to the United States? And because as a pen pal, you don't necessarily think you're ever going to actually meet the person you're meeting to, but how did that come about?
Well, I'd have to check that, but I think it was probably Andrew saying I wish we could meet, you know, and you just don't need. And of course, we were all reassured when we joined Lifelines at that stage. The likelihood of your prisoner being executed is minute, because it wasn't. I mean, I think when he was, there weren't that many. I think there were about 40, 50 when, I can't remember now exactly, but it grew exponentially after that. Because once prosecutors get their teeth into it, and they get one after the other, don't they, particularly in the South. But no, I think, yes, I remember, you know, I must have decided to think, well, you know, Jan says the likelihood of it happening is very minute. And then you said, I want to meet him. I say, well, hope, probably started off with hope one day I may be able to. And then when I think he had his first, because I think he had 3 execution dates while I was writing. 3, certainly 3, might have been more, but certainly 3. You know, I'd love to sit down and talk with you about things. And then you find yourself, whether you, because you feel you have to in a way, because you're the one who's free, saying, you know, I'll come across. And then I was in touch with Nick's office, not with him directly, with somebody else. And they would phone me and say, you know, when I came, you know, he had the stays on the 2, and then you had communication, no, there won't be a stay this time, and he would like you to come across. So I did.
And that must have been quite a culture shock going.
Yes. Never been to America, never been, certainly never been down to New York, which I think is a very exciting place. I have to say, I think, like, told Charlie that if he gets there, let's have some of the best food in the world down there. But no, it was a culture shock, and the worst culture shock of all was the deference from Black people.
Tell me a bit about that and how you felt.
I found it incredibly difficult to deal with, right from the word go. Even, you know, just somebody in the street, a Black person stepping aside and sort of nominally sort of bending their head slightly, but, you know, calling you mom all the time and not looking, not making eye contact. It's a whole deference thing. I found that incredibly difficult to deal with because I wasn't used to it. You know, the kids that I was working with would tell me to, you know, we'd just be, you know, we'd both deal with that. And we had, of course, we had such a good relationship, but I was immediately faced with the fact there wasn't. That was it. Also, the other thing which based on that was the following morning after arriving there, when we did go, I did go straight to visit Andrew's family out in the, literally out in the sticks, you know, and having to stop and ask people, is this the way to whatever it was? And I say the deference again, but the poverty that people lived in, I don't think people, and I've done that all ever since, saying to friends, you have no idea how much poverty there is in America. Absolutely, particularly if you go south, but even anywhere really. People living in cars and living in most awful situations.
Yeah. And how were you received by Andrew's family?
Oh, it was delightful. They were absolutely delightful. You know, it was big hugs and thank you for coming. You know, in fact, it was a bit overwhelming because you think, well, you know, I know I'm doing this, but I wanted to do it. So, you know, it isn't just that I put myself way out in order to come. I wanted to come because I made a promise, and once you make a promise, you keep it. I was always brought up, that's it. So, yeah, so they were brilliant. Absolutely. Then going out and buying, making food was a bit awkward for me because I'm a vegetarian and they didn't know that I had to eat it. But no, we got through that one okay. No, they were extremely, all the children, you know, I don't know when they'd last had somebody white in their company, but it was almost as if I was a sort of a rarity on display. People come from other houses round about to come and see this white lady who's come to go and visit in jail. Yeah, I remember that.
And when you first actually met Andrew in person, were you able to talk like you do in your letters? Was it a little bit awkward? Or?
Yeah, there was, apart from the barrier, which he was in this locked cage and I was outside and he was in, and I couldn't see his face because there's no light on in there. So, of course, being black. Whereas I was in the other half of the room, which is all painted white, and I'm white. So, you know, he could see me very clearly. But I couldn't see him.
Were there bars? It was, yeah.
They were thick ones. They weren't like they have in Texas, which is mesh. They were quite thick. I mean, you know, Louisiana's at least 100 years behind the times in most things, with things like that. So no, it was thick bars, and it wasn't until the reporter from the Baton Rouge paper, actually, the guard came in and said he obviously frequented the prison quite a lot to do interviews, and he got permission from the guard, you know, the main guard, on that we could both come out, and where we got the photograph of sitting side by side.
Yeah. Photograph of you.
That's right.
Yeah.
Which was fortuitous, absolutely fortuitous to do that. It wasn't for very long, but, you know, it was, for both of us, it was really important. But it's interesting, we both got our hands in our laps. Of course, we were told we mustn't, if we touched at all, then they would terminate the visit. Yeah. And I remember the photographer saying, I'm going to take as many photographs as I can and spin it out as long as I can, which was lovely.
Yeah.
He was, I've never spoken to him since, but he was an older man and he was really good. So yeah, so we got that, if you like, iconic picture of the two of us together, which I have, you know, still value very much on that, besides being 30 years younger.
And so I suppose I don't really want to dwell too much on the actual execution and what happened, but if you could just sort of like go through what was going through your mind, who were you with, because you were with Nick and the legal team at that point.
Yeah, it's actually, and I'm sure everybody says the same, it's totally surreal. Mm-hmm. You think any moment somebody's going to say, action, you know, and stop, we've got enough film, we don't need any more, and everything. It's a bit like pandemics things, you know, you wake up and think somebody's going to say, the horror film's over, we're back to normal.
Yeah, you wake up from this horrible dream.
Yeah, exactly. But it was like that, surreal, and you go into just doing what you can. But, you know, I would imagine it's the same sort of thing that happened at the Holocaust. You know, people say, why did they go into, there were more Jews than there were Nazi soldiers. Why did they still go into the trucks and get carted off? But there's an element of, you know, the power which you have, and surreal. And it was like that. It was totally surreal. And then, of course, as I said in the book, Andrew's mother asked me if I could take some photographs of the body afterwards. Because at that time in Louisiana, they were switching from electrocution to lethal injection. And I'd seen the evidence from the Angolite magazine, which I subscribed to for a long time, of the bodies after they had been electrocuted, which was horrific. So they were in the process of arguing, which is how Andrew became the last person to be executed by electrocution, because there was a gubernatorial election coming up, and the governor wanted to be seen as strong, so he wasn't going to back down. He was going to, similar to what Bush has done over those federal prisoners, you know, I'll show them how strong I am and I'm going to do this. I mean, it's a sort of, it's not unusual behavior, I don't think. You know, you want to appear as strong as you can if you're in charge. So I knew what, and she knew what the bodies looked like when after they'd been burnt. So I promised her that I'd go to the funeral parlour, and where I would take some flowers, which I did, and take some photographs. I mean, in the end, I wasn't allowed to. They told me the body was too unpleasant to look at, that they wouldn't allow me to see it, which was a shame, because I think she would have, Andrew's mother would have been, I won't say pleased, she would have been, felt strong from knowing what had happened in that sense. So she never saw the body. Well, they tried to make, I didn't, because I'd left the following day. I didn't stay for the funeral because that was a few days later. But no, that all of us trying to be jolly in that room.
Yeah.
It was just amazing how people were. And people that Andrew, it was lovely. The same happened with Feltus, actually, when he was executed, that he had friends who he hadn't seen for long years who actually came to see him in the end, which restored trust in well, you see where life has turned you. And as we know, people are judged by the worst thing they ever did. I think that's one of the values of being a pen friend. You can put that on one side in many ways, you know.
And I suppose when was it after that experience, which you must have really been in shock coming away from that?
Oh, absolutely.
And so when did the idea of Amicus or the Andrew Lee Jones Fund formulate in your mind?
No, I mean, I suppose it was putting the two together. My experience of racism in this country and my experience of racism over there, which are of different degrees, obviously, was, you know, that I did feel, not always, but in this country there was a slightly better chance of getting some justice. Although my experience a lot with young people was not so. They still got sent to Borstal. But I think, you know, having gone to that pardon board hearing on the Friday and shocked about, you know, again, by what people had to say and the nastiness, you know, this nigger, you know, using words we would definitely not use here. It didn't seem, you know, it was, and the fact that in the end, you know, they said, yes, they would delay it until lethal injection came in the September. But then, of course, the governor reverted, you know, said, no, we're not waiting, we're going to do this. So the last few frantic 24 hours of trying to get, as you know, going up to Supreme Court and all of that, see whether they could get a stay, which didn't happen, of course. So then it begins to sort of merge into, I mean, it is that I'm not a Christian, but that in that room, you know, you have a sort of Christ-like figure in a way, the person who's going to be executed, and everybody doing what they can to comfort them, sitting round a table, and this, that, and the other. There's all those sort of analogies that I'm sure come into a lot of people's heads over that. And it really is, yeah, really sad. And then promising, I always remember promising not to cry when we left the room, when we went all smiles and waves as we went past the glass. And then we all collapsed in the heat as soon as we were outside, you know. And then I went straight from there to be with the family for the rest of the day, which was interesting because it was all very, I won't say jolly, but there's a lot of laughing and singing and drinking. Everybody was drunk while we waited for the news to come through at midnight that he'd actually been executed. It really was. You know, I think they were very brave. I think they were very, you know, it's just an awful system. Bring me back so many memories of things that I've forgotten about. Well, not forgotten, but they're in the back of my brain rather than the front. But the idea then, you said about when my idea came up, was the injustice of it all. And it was meeting the lawyers, meeting Nick and the others, because there were several of them, of course, all working their butts off to do what they could to try and stop this happening. And you know, you have to be so careful, I realised, about not, you know, of being what your part in it was and, you know, staying as a friend. But I was so struck with the total injustice of it all. You know, I was totally spontaneous when we were, I can see us standing by that gate now after the Puffin Award hearing, saying, what can we do to help? Because I felt so helpless. And Dean said, what we need is more people who are prepared to fight for these people. So it was as simple as that. It was nothing more profound.
Yeah, that was it. Well, that's quite profound. And that was it. Amicus was born from that.
And it's practical.
Yeah.
Because I'm a practical person, I think, in that sense. You know, if there's a job that needs doing, we'll just find somebody to do it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And of course, with Sophie, you know, it was just...
Yes, tell us a bit about Sophie and how Sophie got involved.
Well, obviously Sophie was a damn sight lot younger than I was. She was only in her 20s then, early 20s. Just qualified as a barrister. And so she was a writer as well. She was writing to somebody, I think she was writing to somebody in Texas. I don't know, was writing.
Yeah, she had a couple of pen pals, so yeah.
Yeah, that's right. I think, you know, and I think at the time she was also considering Quakerism as well. So I think that fed into it a bit as well. And we'd seen 14 Days in May, so many people had, which was one trigger, obviously, for that. And I can't remember how it happened. I don't know whether she contacted me or I contacted her. I can't honestly remember. You'd have to ask her.
Yeah.
But, and it was brilliant because she was a lawyer, so she knew the way, you know, to things which, you know, got us eventually our charity status. But there was the first 2 or 3, certainly 2, if not 2.5 to 3 years, you know, it was mainly Sophie and myself. You know, I'd go down to London, we'd have meetings, and then we tried and get 1 or 2 other people involved, you know, who would want to, because we weren't being paid for doing anything. We were just trying to work out connections that we could actually do something.
And in the early days, what was it that, can you describe? So you were fundraising.
Well, I managed to do, I've forgotten about this, yeah. When I got back to the UK, I hadn't realised that there was a lot of publicity, because nobody had ever had got out that I was over there, and that picture in the paper, which I knew nothing about. It reverberated on my poor daughter Caroline, actually, because she was staying here in my house while I was away, and she was had racists coming around shouting at the house and so on. They managed to locate where we live. It actually damaged our relationship for about a year, because she felt that I should have been more careful about what I was doing, even though she'd been very pro me doing it. And she suggested it, that I did go over, because I had to ask her, obviously, if that was okay. and she had a really nasty time with people. Because it was in several of the national newspapers as well.
Yeah.
But then Nick Davis who already was somebody who'd been involved with Lifelines anyway. He'd written about them. So Nick Davis contacted me and asked if I could do an interview, which was actually a bit later. That was in '92 when I was trying. Sister Helen came across and she stayed here with me while she did a Lifelines conference over the road, George Cadbury Hall. So she stayed with me, and and we talked about, and Benjamin Zephaniah came along as well. So that was a good one. That we had a lot of people. So, but he had that weekend, by chance more than anything else, because the Guardian then used to do a long piece, a magazine piece, every Saturday, and he wrote a piece about that, which came out the weekend of the Lifelines conference. So, you know, it's sort of, I'm just wondering whether, don't know whether we started then, but certainly Sophie was there. And I think that's when we got other people out. I got Benjamin Zephaniah to, if he'd be one of our patrons, which he did. He's always been very generous with that. And I'd also, as a result of Nick's article, every time there was something in the newspaper about the death penalty, which seemed to be so round there, I'd write a letter. So I got to the newspapers. So, well, more particularly to my, the Guardian and the Observer. But actually managed to get, you know, a fair, you know, we got enough to, the time if I diligently watched the papers and then wrote a letter about the situation, making people more aware. And we did, which gave us enough, I think, to the idea that Sophie and I had of sending students over there, a law student, just paying for their fare, if we get somebody to look after them once they got over there. Because we must have got, well, obviously through Louisiana, I'd got the connection there. So that's how it started, really. And it was a struggle for some time. And then we had dynamic people like Claire joining, who really shifts it into another gear, because of her connections as much as anything, and other people. So, and John York was our first student from here.
Professor John York now at Birmingham City University. Yeah.
So John was lovely, and he was brilliant actually, because he, you know, well, he's such a lovely person. He was so devoted to the idea. So it was good messages and going with him going. Yeah, there's all sorts of, you realise how it's a bit like Topsy, kept growing and growing, but you look over it. And yeah, I mean, there were two or three times when Sophie and I almost gave up, because there were just the two of us and nobody. And Julian Killingly came along as well, occasionally to London. But we always was in London on a Saturday morning. We met in Sophie's office, so we could meet there. Okay. But sometimes we weren't even quarreled, but we still carried on. We you know, go out and have lunch, and afterwards down at Easter Express or something, and talk about what can we do, because we weren't going to give up. And also by that time, also, I suppose from my point of view, I was the coordinator for Louisiana by this time as well, because after I came back.
Yeah. So
I was also I was being written to a lot by the guys on the road asking for pen friends. And with Sister Helen, actually at that friends meeting, at that Lifelines conference, she asked me to write to, if I could get somebody to write to Feltus Taylor, because he'd just arrived on the road. So I contacted him. I got him two other pen friends. So I was his mother. Well, this is what he decided. He always signed his letter, "Your loving son," and one who was were his sisters. So we did that, and then, as I say, I had that horrifying experience of almost exactly 10 years later, being with the same lawyers, the same prosecutors,
Yeah. Oh my gosh.
which was really, really weird. And you know, I couldn't cry. I must have, I just could not cry. It just sort of,
was that a kind of numbness to the?
It was, yeah.
Protecting yourself.
Because that time we were standing outside the prison holding hands in a circle singing, you know, one of the hymns, till somebody came out and shouted, "He's dead," you know, he died at this time. It was, yeah. I didn't want to write to anybody much. I did have to, because I wrote to too many Texas who were both executed as well. But I have the same sort of relationship with them.
And so now, do you still write to anyone now? No.
I did write for some time to somebody who wrote to me first of all in Louisiana, who was a lifer with perhaps the most horrible personal history I've ever encountered. But he gradually developed, he descended into mental illness, and it was impossible to keep going. But then I made a friend got more, you know, well, you've been in communication with Maureen Kelleher.
Oh yeah.
Still doing the quilts again. She's working so hard from
project. That's a great project. I love that project.
You'd love her if you met. She's just such a lovely person. Eccentric, yeah, but lovely, you know, and so devoted to doing everything she can for those guys.
No, she's great.
So I've still got connections in that way.
Good. Yeah, and now, as we were saying before we started recording, that now your grandson is so he read so beautifully when we were launching the book, the republication of the book, the new edit of the book. I want to say last year, but it was 2 years ago now, wasn't it? 2019. In the November 2019 is when we launched it, and your grandson Charlie actually read a piece for you. That was powerful. And of course, he's 20 years old, you were saying, so he's really
he's coming, you know, August.
Yeah. So
certainly. No, he's very proud of not just that, but of the whole thing, because I think, you know, it's not something I hadn't realized. You don't talk about these things. You know, it's in many ways it's kept all of that is separate from my life as such. There are lots of people who have no idea. It's not a good opener when you talk meetings. And you know, I fell out with her. Well, I didn't mean to, but it was so awkward, and she didn't understand. She said afterwards, she sort of, this is when just after Andrew was executed and came back, she said, I'll never forgive you for not telling me what you were doing. And I said, Jeanette, have you ever thought how awkward it is? You know, do I say to you, oh, by the way, Jeanette, I'm writing to somebody on death row, when that is anything part of our life at all, you know, it's not a good opener on that. So, you know, and in any case, to be fair to myself, the parts I don't really want to share, there's something about it which is also quite
intimate.
Yeah, that's right, absolutely. And then, you know, people were one or two people who found out because I'd written a letter in the paper, and they rang me up, what are you writing letters about? Have you been doing this? And sort of sorted out like that. Yeah.
That's very interesting.
One of the things you mentioned, this is I'll tell you who I hadn't realized that Rebecca Williams was, do you know, I never knew she was Shirley Williams' daughter. And because I had quite a lot of contact with her, because she wrote to somebody in Louisiana, she and Chris. And it wasn't until I'd seen something recently in the Wing of Friendship, actually, that I put two and two together. But she never said it outright.
Yeah. Yeah.
A bit about that, which I think is admirable. But that was so sad over Chris. So sad. Mm.
And I guess to round off really, but how do you feel? So obviously Amicus has changed so much over the last 30 years, and just to give people just a taster of the things that we're doing now, we have, you know, over 1,000 lawyers who are actively working today on death penalty projects and cases for Amicus. As part of their pro bono projects, we have, you know, we have 18 affiliate law firms who work with us. We are in, we're running clinics in the several universities. Pre-pandemic, we were sending 30 odd people over every year to work in almost every death penalty state on the front line. Like John did back all those years back, like 28 years ago. You must be incredibly proud of what Amicus has become and the help that they have. It's been to so many people.
I am so thrilled about it. I love the fact that it isn't, you know, it's lovely to talk to you, Margot, and do this, but I'm so glad that it moved on. Nothing, you know, there are so many organizations which, when, you know, don't move on and develop and do and branch out and do other things.
Yeah.
And I know one of the biggest problems initially was to start with was to actually, that American lawyers felt confident about having people. Yeah. Because that's a hard one to overcome, because you don't realize what hard work it is when you get there if you don't have the skills to deal with it. And I think that has been, the training has been absolutely amazing.
Yeah. The training, I think the training for me in that respect is the key, because obviously we're trying to help people, and there's no point in us sending someone over who then needs to be trained up for half the time that they're there. So our goal very much is to provide these officers with people who can hit the ground running, essentially, and have the basic skills and knowledge to get on with the job that they need to get on with independently, and be a real support. And I think that we've proven that through the years with the caliber of people as well that we've sent over. And so yeah, it astounds me as well at how well respected we are across the...
Yes, absolutely. And I think actually making it possible to do the work in this country as well. You know, you don't have to go out to do some work to help, because, you know, I did have a go once at trying to do a transcript with Julian Killingley.
Some transcripts, yeah.
The main points. I'm quite good at that, but golly, it was hard work. And I and you realize it's the time consuming bit. Yeah. You know, that would take, it's not something you do. That's why when you see it saying, well, Boris Johnson must have read that, and you think, no, you know, actually reading something, a thick wad, is going to take a hell of a lot of time to do, and referring that to. No, and it's lovely that, as I say, and my daughter Caroline has a friend who's working, Alison, who's working.
Yeah.
And that she when that happened, Caroline rang me up. She said, "You'd never guess she was doing some work for Amicus." You know, Alice, and she loves it.
Alison's fabulous, and she's really pushed the project forward in her law firm as well.
Yeah. So I think that is lovely, to do that, and getting people to do some like that. So that's lovely. But I don't know. It's been. I'm sad. You know, it's sad that what the starting point was, but you know, I do often think so. Andrew would be so proud to know.
I was going to say, actually, what do you think Andrew would think now?
Oh, I can imagine he had a.
Yeah.
He was full of fun when he was knocked down, and you know, and he's, you know, I can just see him now, absolutely big grin, you know, ear to ear. In my name, you know, me, important in that sense. I think he'd be, feel that that it was a worthwhile thing. And I think the fact also that he wasn't that he was somebody who would always be ambiguous to whether he committed that crime or not. Really doesn't matter. You know, you could have had somebody who was innocent or something, but the fact that and sadly more impact from the fact that it was ended up as an ambiguous case anyway. There's a lot of things. I mean, Nick's once said to me, there are a lot of things about it you don't know. No, I'm not going to tell, you know, you don't need to know them about what went on. But yeah.
And I suppose, yeah, finally, there is the you know, there is the amazing achievement of what Amicus is today, and hopefully will be in the future as well, continuing to support people and continuing our work. And there is a lot of work to still be done. But did you think 30 years ago, was there part of you that thought, well, that in 30 years time, back then in 93, there wouldn't be a death penalty in the United States and there would be no need for Amicus at that point?
Well, you mean at that time, I was just amazed that there was such a thing. As I said right at the beginning, if you'd asked me, I'd have thought there was just a handful of people on death row, and the realization that it's a huge, huge problem, you know, and then the basis of it is mainly racism. So, you know, there's two things totally different. I always remember that, as I think I said in my foreword, the night that what's her name, you know, was the last woman to be hanged. Was, you know who I mean, anyway. I had it a minute ago.
In a second, yeah.
Yeah. That I was absolutely horrified because, you know, it was obviously a crime of passion, and she, poor woman, was in a dreadful state. There's, you know, I thought that, and, you know, it brought out another place a couple of, 18 months ago, can't remember now with all this pandemic that went on. I went with my closest friend, who is from Belfast originally. We went over there and we did a tour of the Crumlin jail. And what part of the place they showed us was the execution room, the hanging.
Gosh.
And, you know, I was glad we did go. We were said, you want to go and see it because, you know, and it's so bare, and it's very small. But the idea that people were killed, with legally killed in this room, it was just so absolutely, you know, it brought sort of, I knew why it was against capital punishment. It doesn't solve anything at all, it just makes things worse. And, you know, it was just, everybody and I suppose the other thing about starting to write, everybody needs a friend who they can talk to about things. So that was the initial start. The fact that it developed into something much bigger was, you know, I couldn't anticipate that happening. But I suppose with my background, that was where it actually came through. And then a lot of it's chance. I mean, like having Sophie, who was, you know, I would never have managed without Sophie, because she lived in London and she knew all the ins and outs of the legal thing. She had connections with people, you know, helped us get charitable.
Yeah, wonderful Sophie. Sophie Garner was really the person who she got the charity, its charitable status, and did all the administrative, and she was a company secretary and everything for Amicus for a very long time.
Yeah, I think it's one of the, again, and you can, as opposed to another charity that we know of, there was hopefully no specific head person, that it was devolved into people doing their jobs. Mine was a minor job by comparison.
Their own egos, or
Charity, the one who's, you know, wanted the figurehead, fell out with him a number of times, I can tell you. But it wasn't, you know, didn't need a figurehead, because what we were doing was everybody was, and it's why you get so many admirable people, I think, that they want to contribute to the whole thing. They don't want to say, oh, there's a career change for me, which will make me well known through this, that, and the other. No, they want to contribute because their focus is on the people who are in prison. The focus is not just on people in prison, but the families, the lawyers, and I always feel the lawyers, like Nick and the others, is how they carry on year after year doing that with the stress it causes, I do not know. And you know, all of those things are so important, and it isn't just resting on one person at all. And I think
that's very important. Yeah,
it's expanded in that way, and that, you know, I just feel so proud of that. Something that was relatively, well, dead easy to do, and say, what can we do to help? And that was all I said. What can we do to help? And said, we actually need more people working on it. Because it's when you go to, I've been to conferences there fairly soon afterwards, and realised that everybody who's a capital defence lawyer was in that room. There are no others.
That's what I mean. I was talking to Nick the other day, and that's what he was saying, that when he then there were very few capital defence attorneys, and they were despised by everybody. And so really working with Amicus, and you creating Amicus, really was one of the first times that he felt supported and valued for the work that he was doing. It was a very solitary thing, I think, and it still is to a certain extent for many people, although the community is definitely larger and more connected and more supportive than it was, certainly.
And also, I think it's always fascinated me how clever all of them get with naming their offices, so that the word death penalty doesn't come into the title.
No, of course,
Centre for Justice, or, you know, all sorts of weird things that you may or you don't. That, because, well, you know, Nick, have you been to New Orleans? Yeah, so you know how you have to sort of more or less hide the office so that it's just, is it still in the church up the
Nick's office is in the church, like almost the whole basement of the church.
And then when you think about the you know, fancy lawyers and what they have, you just have to carry on in the space that you've got.
Well, thank you, Jane, so much for talking with us today, talking with me today. It's so good to see you, and it's amazing to be here 30 years on and continue the legacy of Amicus. And it is my dear hope that in the not too distant future, the need for Amicus will not be there anymore, and there will be no death penalty.
That is the star at the end.
And we can all retire. But till then, we will fight on, and we will continue with all of the generations now of, as we were saying before, generations of dedicated people who are committed to this. As a final thought, what would you say to people who are thinking about getting involved with Amicus, and why they should?
Well, the first one is say, really think about it to start with. What are you doing it for? Are you doing it for yourself, or are you doing it for other people? Because that's what it's all about, is other people. You know, you also have another thing I think need to be, though hopefully lawyers are, well, most people should be non-judgmental about what you might, because you get, you know, you'd hear about some really unpleasant things which some people couldn't cope with, but you're not there for that purpose. But bearing in mind that most people who apply would be people who've gone through law school anyway, I would assume, not all of them, obviously. And I think, you know, it's one way of I do think it is one way of looking at racism as well, because that comes through so often. And I feel very strongly about the whole issue of racism. I think, you know, whatever. So, and then the finest, go for it.
Thank you. Thank you, Jane.
Okay.